Is there any indication that Turkey will find a way out of this and actually come to an agreement with the US?
Well, I was just going to say, Francine, you mentioned just a second ago that one thing would be central bank independence and a much tighter monetary policy. But the other quick fix, obviously, is to try to get out of this political spat with the US. I noticed just before I came over to your studio that Hurriyet in Istanbul is reporting today that there will be some Turkish delegation, not specified exactly who, which level of officials, in Washington, D.C. in a couple of days from now, perhaps trying to patch something up, despite the apparently intransigent position of the Turkish leader, President Erdogan. So that's probably the main thing for the markets to look out for in the next day or two.
Right, but what happens if they, if they can't find a way out of this? What happens to the economy and what happens to lira? Are we looking at capital controls?
It's got to be some dramatic change. The dramatic change could simply be a very hard landing for the economy with high inflation and recession, total stagflation, and Turkish assets and the currency, they look cheap. They could get cheaper before the bounce back happens, but it's going to be a shock of one type or another, either a policy shock or a macro shock or some combination of the two. But the way to sugar that pill would be, as your colleague in Istanbul just said, a political accommodation with the US. That would make the pain much less, or in both senses, and the risk of more pain correspondingly lower.
Is the political accommodation, Christopher, and this goes back to your tour of duty in Moscow with the United Kingdom years ago, that Mr. Putin shows up at the door? There's an ageless tendency of Russia to look towards Turkey. With the turmoil within the Trump administration, within American foreign policy, is this a gift that just keeps on giving for Mr. Putin?
Well, it's been giving quite nicely for him, Tom, in the last couple of years, essentially since President Erdogan patched up differences with Russia following the shooting down of a Russian plane quite early after Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war. And that patch-up came before the failed coup in Turkey in July 2016. So it dates back quite a good way, and you're seeing the results of that in the cooperation in the Syrian theatre, in economic ties between Turkey and Russia. Record Russian tourists on the Turkish beaches this summer, by the way, about 6 million of them. But nevertheless, that's all useful but marginal for Turkey's basic macroeconomic and financial problems, and the FX exposure of its banks and corporates being the absolute key. So I wouldn't say that there are any geopolitical get-out or easy escapes. Even Chinese financing. Right. Look at the Russian experience. After sanctions, Russia has got some Chinese financing for some projects, but it's no real substitute. The financial power of the United States is such that countries need to accommodate.